August 18, 1945. The jungles of Luzon are still heavy with the scent of cordite and rot. A thin haze of smoke drifts over the remnants of a Japanese field encampment, collapsed tents, shattered rifles, and the faint echo of surrender. In a clearing near the foothills of the Sierra Madre, a group of Japanese women, their uniforms tattered and faces streaked with grime, stand in silence. They are nurses, clerks, and auxiliary personnel of the Imperial Japanese Army, now prisoners of war. Their eyes scan the horizon nervously as the distant rumble of trucks grows louder. The engines carry a strange rhythm, deep, confident, and almost mechanical in precision. It's a sound none of them have heard before. When the convoy finally rounds the bend, the women freeze. Out of the dust emerge the silhouettes of American soldiers, tall, broad-shouldered figures clad in olive drab, helmets glinting in the morning sun. For the first time, these Japanese women, raised on tales of the barbaric enemy devils, are seeing Americans up close. U.S. Army Signal Corps Film Unit, August 1945. The air is thick with contradiction. They had been told the Americans were monsters, brutal, lawless men who would defile and destroy without mercy. But the figures stepping down from the trucks looked nothing like the propaganda posters that had adorned Tokyo's schools. These men move with deliberate calm, weapons slung casually, but eyes alert. One lights a cigarette and offers another to a nearby corporal. Another removes his helmet, revealing a weary face smudged with dust and kindness. The Japanese nurses watch in disbelief as an American medic kneels beside one of their wounded, checking her pulse before signaling for a stretcher. Imperial Japanese War Ministry broadcast, March 1945, only days earlier. These same women had crouched in bunkers during the last artillery exchanges, clutching morphine kits and preparing for the inevitable. They had been instructed to die rather than be captured. Better death than dishonor, their commanding officer had told them. Yet now, surrounded by the victors, dishonor feels strangely humane. The Americans offer them water, clear, cold water from metal canteens, and soft, white bread. The youngest of the group hesitates before taking a bite, her hands trembling. The texture shocks her. The taste feels alien, impossibly rich. Japanese Nurse Diary, Luzon Sector, 1945. To understand the weight of that moment, one must return to the world that shaped it. By mid-1945, Japan's war machine was collapsing under the strain of total war. Allied forces had clawed their way across the Pacific, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Leyte, Okinawa, each island a graveyard of empire. The Imperial Japanese Army, once invincible in Asia, was now scattered and starving. Communications had disintegrated. Supply convoys were decimated by American submarines. Food shortages ravaged the front lines. By the time of Japan's surrender on August 15th, many outposts in the Philippines and New Guinea were isolated, unaware the war had even ended. U.S. Strategic Command Brief, August 1945. Among the stranded were thousands of women who had served in supporting roles, nurses, typists, and telegraph operators. They had followed the army to the tropics, believing they were serving a holy cause. Most were civilians conscripted through the Volunteer Nurses Corps, trained in Tokyo hospitals before being sent to the front. They tended to the wounded in primitive field stations where infection, not bullets, claimed the most lives. When American bombardments intensified in 1945, their units dissolved into the jungle. Many hid, waiting for death. Japanese Red Cross records, 1947. For the American soldiers, their discovery was equally shocking. They had expected hardened resistance, fanatics, or snipers. Instead, they found a group of women, emaciated and terrified, yet standing at attention in perfect silence. The sergeant in charge, a 24-year-old from Kansas named Robert H. Latham, had seen enough of war to distrust appearances. But as he stepped closer, his weapon lowered instinctively. "They looked at us like we weren't real," he later recalled. Like they'd seen ghosts. U.S. Army After-Action Interview, Luzon, 1946. The Japanese women, too, were caught between disbelief and dread. The stories they'd been told about American cruelty crumbled with each passing minute. Instead of abuse, there was order. Instead of mockery, restraint. An American lieutenant ordered that they be taken to a medical station for examination before processing as POWs. The women followed quietly, heads bowed, unable to reconcile propaganda with reality. One of them, 22-year-old nurse Sachiko Watanabe, wrote in her post-war testimony, "I had feared they would strip us, beat us, humiliate us. Instead, one soldier gave me his jacket because I was shivering. I could not look him in the eye." Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal Archives, 1948. The first night of captivity was filled with an eerie calm. Under canvas tents illuminated by weak lanterns, the Japanese nurses sat in rows while American medics distributed rations, canned meat, coffee, and bread. Some of the women cried silently, not from fear, but from the realization that their captors were human. One American guard, noticing their hesitation, tried to comfort them through gestures. He drew a small flower on a scrap of paper and handed it over. It was a moment of fragile humanity amid the ashes of total war. U.S. Red Cross Field Notes, September 1945. Yet beneath the surface of this uneasy peace, the larger machinery of history was shifting. The surrender of Japan had opened a new moral frontier: how to treat those who had once been demonized beyond redemption. For the Americans, this was more than mercy, it was strategy. The U.S. Army's Psychological Warfare Division had explicitly instructed troops to display fairness towards surrendering personnel, hoping to accelerate demoralization across remaining Japanese pockets. Acts of compassion were now tools of influence. Psychological Warfare Division Memo, August 1945. But for the Japanese women, mercy felt like dissonance. Their empire had promised them glory through sacrifice. Their culture had sanctified loyalty unto death. Now, in the presence of the enemy's compassion, they faced a different kind of humiliation: the collapse of a moral universe. The nurses whispered among themselves, questioning everything they had believed. How could the enemy, these calm, clean, strange-smelling men, show more dignity than those who had sent them to die? Imperial War Ministry Oral Histories, 1950. As dawn approached, the camp stirred with the routines of occupation. Flags were raised, rosters checked, and medical supplies inventoried. The Americans photographed their captives for documentation, images that would later circulate in intelligence reports as evidence of humane treatment. The women, eyes hollow but curious, watched the men's movements with a mixture of fear and fascination. They noticed how the Americans laughed easily, how they moved without the rigid formality of Japanese troops. They were powerful, but not cruel; victorious, but not boastful. U.S. Army Intelligence Bulletin, 1945. That night, as the nurses lay awake on military cots beneath a foreign sky, one thought echoed through their ranks: the enemy was not what we had been told. And yet, they wondered, if these men were not demons, what did that make them? The soldiers of a lost empire, witnesses to its ruin. In the morning, the convoy would move again, this time toward Manila, where the world's press waited to record the faces of Japan's first female prisoners of war. What they would see next would shake not only their understanding of the enemy, but also of their own place in a world turned upside down. The convoy rumbled down the battered road toward Manila, its tires grinding through puddles left by the monsoon rains. The captured Japanese nurses sat in the back of the trucks, wrapped in army blankets. For many, it was their first time seeing the scale of American occupation. Roads once lined with bamboo were now carved by convoys, radio poles, and makeshift command posts. Jeeps roared past, each bristling with antennas and strange instruments that hummed faintly when they stopped. The women watched with quiet awe. To them, it looked like the Americans had built an entire city from thin air. U.S. Army Logistics Film Unit, September 1945. The truth was that they had. Behind the calm efficiency the nurses witnessed lay a hidden advantage that defined the American war effort: communication. It wasn't superior numbers or better weapons alone that broke Japan's empire. It was the invisible web of radio frequencies, signal networks, and field logistics that bound millions of soldiers across oceans into one synchronized machine. U.S. Signal Corps Operations Report, 1945. To the Japanese, the sight of a single walkie-talkie seemed like witchcraft. In 1945, most imperial units still relied on runners, flags, or field phones limited by wire length. American troops, on the other hand, carried SCR-300 FM radios, compact, backpack transmitters capable of clear, static-free communication across 5 miles of jungle or 10 miles of open terrain. Developed by Galvin Manufacturing Corporation, later known as Motorola, the SCR-300 had changed the tempo of battle. Weighing 35 pounds and powered by a hand-carried BA-70 battery, it transmitted between 40 and 48 MHz with unmatched clarity. Technical Manual TM11 to 242, 1943. In the jungles of Luzon and Leyte, where terrain swallowed sound and vision, this clarity was lethal. While Japanese commanders struggled to coordinate retreating battalions through messengers, American platoons could call artillery, airstrikes, or resupply within seconds. The difference between a coordinated defense and total annihilation often came down to those FM bursts crackling through the tropical rain. Signal Corps Combat Evaluation, January 1945. When the Japanese nurses were brought to an American field hospital on the outskirts of Manila, they began to notice the strange devices everywhere: tall masts, coiled wires, and soldiers constantly speaking into microphones clipped to their collars. The Americans seemed to exist in two worlds at once: the physical battlefield and an invisible one of voices and codes. One nurse whispered to another, "They speak to each other like spirits." Dramatized composite. From interviews recorded in 1948, the hidden power of communication wasn't limited to the front line. It extended deep into America's industrial core. In factories from Chicago to Schenectady, engineers had transformed radio science into an art of logistics. Companies like Western Electric, Collins Radio, and General Electric developed modular signal systems that could be assembled in the field. Every tank, truck, and aircraft carried a compatible frequency band, allowing seamless coordination between branches, a level of integration Japan never achieved. Bureau of Ships Report, 1944. In one of the captured nurses' testimonies, Sachiko Watanabe described her disbelief at seeing an American field workshop repair a truck radio within minutes. They replaced a broken part, and the sound returned instantly. "We had no such thing. Our radios broke and stayed broken." Tokyo Post-War Testimony Archive, 1948. At the front, this technological gulf came to its deadliest expression during the Battle of the Villa Verde Trail, a brutal confrontation in northern Luzon between February and May 1945. The terrain was hell itself: steep ridges, dense forests, and ravines that swallowed entire platoons. Japanese forces of the 23rd Division had fortified caves and bunkers along the mountain passes, believing the Americans could not possibly coordinate attacks in such chaos. They were wrong. U.S. 6th Army Report, May 1945. American infantry of the 32nd Division advanced in coordinated waves. Each company carried an SCR-536 handy-talkie, a 1.5-pound radio operating on AM frequencies around 3.5 MHz. Though shorter range than the SCR-300, it allowed squad leaders to maintain contact across the dense jungle. Whenever resistance stiffened, coordinates were transmitted to artillery units miles away. Minutes later, 105 mm howitzers thundered in reply. Technical Manual TM11 to 235, 1943. Japanese defenders, unable to jam or intercept the FM signals, found themselves blind. Their field telephones were cut by shell fire, runners were lost in the mud, and messages that reached command were often hours late. Captain Kenji Takamura of the 23rd Division wrote in his final diary entry, "They strike like lightning. Before we can move, the sky answers their call." Dramatized composite, based on Japanese POW interrogations, 1946. The coordination reached astonishing precision. Engineers with the 96th Signal Battalion established relay stations on mountain peaks, powered by truck-mounted generators and cooled by improvised water systems. Using the SCR-399, a massive high-frequency radio truck weighing over 5 tons, they maintained contact with air commands in Lingayen Gulf, 80 miles away. The result: instantaneous tactical intelligence. Signal Battalion After-Action Report, 1945. When the Americans finally breached the Villa Verde line, Japanese resistance shattered. Entire pockets surrendered without firing. Among the captives were medical staff and auxiliary women who had spent months in bunkers. Their first question to their captors, recorded by interpreters, was not about food or safety. It was, "How did you always know where we were?" U.S. Army Interrogation Summary, June 1945. That invisible edge, the hum of radios, the coded chatter of signal corps operators, haunted them. Even days after capture, Japanese POWs spoke of the voices in the air. They believed the Americans had some supernatural device. In reality, it was the product of engineers like Daniel E. Noble, the Motorola researcher who pioneered frequency modulation for battlefield radios, and thousands of factory workers, many of them women, assembling crystal oscillators in Illinois plants. Motorola Engineering Memo, 1944. In Manila, as the female prisoners recovered under guard, they saw the technology up close for the first time. A young radio operator demonstrated an SCR 300, letting them listen as another unit reported from 20 miles away. The clear English words drifted through the static. Convoy Alpha moving north. Supplies secured. The women stared in silence, understanding, perhaps for the first time, that Japan's defeat had not only been on the battlefield but also in the ether. U.S. Army Signal Corps demonstration footage, September 1945. Their reaction was recorded by Lieutenant Latham in his diary. They looked terrified, not of us, but of the sound, as if the radio itself had humiliated them. Personal diary, Latham Papers, 1945. That humiliation was the essence of Japan's downfall, not the loss of honor, but the loss of comprehension. The empire that had mastered the sword and the bayonet could not grasp a war fought with circuits and frequencies. Its doctrines were rooted in courage and endurance, not data and transmission. And so, courage met coordination, and courage lost, when the nurses were transported later to a processing camp near Bilibid Prison. The Americans photographed them beside the equipment that symbolized their defeat: a field radio, a jeep, and a typewriter. The images appeared in American newspapers weeks later, framed as proof of civilization overcoming fanaticism. But to those women, it was something far more complex, a portrait of a vanished world facing the future in silence. Associated Press War Photo Series, October 1945. The hidden advantage was not just machines. It was mindset. The Americans believed communication was power, that a soldier's voice could be a weapon. The Japanese had believed silence was a virtue. On that difference, an empire had fallen. And in the quiet of the POW camp, as night fell over the Manila plains, the women listened again to the faint crackle of a distant radio, the heartbeat of a new kind of warfare that had already rewritten their fate. By the autumn of 1945. The war was over, but the echoes of its machinery still hummed through the tropics. The Japanese female POWs, now processed and registered under Allied supervision, were transferred to rehabilitation centers near Manila. The city itself was a graveyard of empires: burned-out churches, half-collapsed hotels, and endless columns of trucks moving like veins through a wounded body. Amid this ruin, the prisoners began to see something strange: an army that could build faster than it could destroy. U.S. Army Reconstruction Log, October 1945. Every morning, they watched American engineers raise antenna masts and rebuild bridges. Bulldozers moved with relentless rhythm, clearing debris while portable generators powered radio outposts and medical stations. The air crackled with static, the same invisible force that had haunted them on the battlefield. But now it wasn't a weapon. It was a lifeline. The same FM signals that once guided artillery were now coordinating food drops, repatriation flights, and hospital convoys. To the Japanese women, it seemed as if the Americans spoke to the sky itself, and the sky obeyed. Signal Corps Reconstruction Report, November 1945. Inside the camp, they began to learn fragments of English: water, bread, doctor. The interactions, once laced with terror, became tentative acts of humanity. American medics treated their wounds, while female nurses from the Red Cross handed out soap and vitamins. The prisoners marveled not at the medicine but at the organization: every action documented, every bottle labeled, every message transmitted instantly through a humming handset. It was bureaucracy turned to mercy. U.S. Red Cross Humanitarian Field Notes, 1945. For the Americans, these women were no longer enemies. They were witnesses, living proof that Japan's surrender was not only military, but psychological. Reports from the U.S. Psychological Warfare Division described visible disorientation among female POWs, noting how continued exposure to Allied procedures produces behavioral shifts characterized by compliance and disbelief. In essence, the women were watching a new moral order unfold, one grounded in communication, efficiency, and procedure. Psychological Warfare Division Debrief, December 1945. One of the prisoners, former nurse Yukiko Matsuda, later recalled how the smallest acts dismantled years of indoctrination. "They lined us up and gave us toothbrushes," she said in a 1952 interview. "We had never seen such things in the jungle. I thought, how can people who make war also make this kindness?" Post-War Oral History Project, Tokyo University, 1952. The shock ran both ways. American soldiers, many barely out of their teens, had never met Japanese women except as distant, faceless enemies. To them, the captured nurses were symbols of the propaganda that had fueled years of hatred. Yet face to face, the divide shrank. Sergeant Latham wrote home that month, "They bow when they see us. I don't know if it's fear or respect. Maybe both. But I see something else, relief. Like they're glad it's us and not their own officers." Latham Personal Letters. October 1945. What neither side fully realized was that these small, human moments marked the beginning of a vast post-war transformation. The same technologies that had given America dominance in the field, portable radios, signal networks, and data transmission, became the backbone of Reconstruction. Engineers from Motorola and Collins Radio stayed behind under Army contracts, establishing training schools for communication officers in Manila, Seoul, and Tokyo. Their goal: rebuild Asia not through conquest, but through connection. Army Corps of Engineers Transition Plan, 1946. The irony was staggering. Japan's defeat had come through radio, and now its rebirth would depend on it. Within 2 years, Japanese technicians trained under U.S. guidance were repairing surplus Signal Corps equipment. By 1947, converted radio stations in Tokyo began broadcasting peace programming and health bulletins to a nation emerging from starvation. Many of the same women who had served as POW nurses found work as clerks or interpreters in these stations. "We learned the language of the enemy," one recalled, "and it became the language of life." NHK Reconstruction Archives, 1947. Still, the human cost lingered. Every night, the prisoners dreamed of the jungle, the screams, the mud, and the moments before capture. Some awoke shaking, haunted by guilt for surviving. Others clung to the strange comfort of routine: the American Guards patrol, the evening broadcast of military news, and the distant sound of generators. "That hum," wrote Watanabe in her 1951 memoir, "was the sound of our new world. It was the sound that replaced silence, and silence was all we had left." Watanabe Memoir. The White Uniform, 1951. For the Allied Command, these camps became laboratories of re-education. Psychologists from the Strategic Bombing Survey interviewed hundreds of POWs to assess morale, obedience, and psychological shock. Their conclusion was clear: the greatest blow to Japanese resistance had not been Hiroshima or Nagasaki. It had been the collapse of belief. The enemy had learned that power was not only measured in bombs, but also in coordination, compassion, and communication. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, Morale Division, 1946. By 1948, most of the female POWs had been repatriated. Their return to Japan was quiet, almost invisible. The government, embarrassed by their survival, rarely mentioned them. But privately, their stories spread. In households from Osaka to Sendai, women whispered of the Americans they had seen, not devils, but men of discipline and strange decency. The myth of invincible purity that the Imperial Army had preached was gone. In its place was an uneasy respect for the power of systems, and for the idea that compassion could be weaponized as effectively as steel. Japanese Women's Association Report, 1948. Meanwhile, in Washington, the lessons of the Pacific hardened into doctrine. The U.S. military concluded that coordination through communication, what they now called command and control networks, was the decisive factor in modern warfare. Within a decade, The principles born in the jungles of Luzon would evolve into early computer networks, radar integration systems, and, eventually, the backbone of Cold War strategy. Department of Defense Technical Review, 1955. The echo of that invisible advantage would be felt in every war that followed. In Korea, radio-linked artillery would save trapped regiments at Chosin. In Vietnam, FM coordination would turn helicopters into precision strike tools. And in the Persian Gulf, digital communications would let a single division move with the speed of an entire army. The thread that began with a humming transmitter in the Philippine jungle would stretch across half a century of global warfare. U.S. Army Signal Corps Historical Summary, 1991. But for the women who first heard that hum, the legacy was personal. Many lived quietly, their experiences unspoken until old age. Some wrote diaries. Others never spoke of it again. Yet in their silence was understanding. That power did not lie in weapons, but in the unseen links that bound one human to another. When one of them, Yukiko Matsuda, was interviewed in 1970, she said only, "I learned that the strongest army was the one that could listen." The war that had promised glory delivered only ghosts. Yet from those ashes came something unexpected, a lesson that would shape generations, that in war, as in peace, the greatest victories are not won by the loudest guns, but by the clearest signals. And so the story of those Japanese women, terrified, starving, and awestruck before their captors, becomes something larger than defeat. It becomes a mirror of the 20th century itself, a transformation from empire to information, from silence to sound. The final American transport departed Manila Bay in early 1946. The radio operator signed off with a simple phrase that would echo through history: "Mission complete. Frequency clear." And somewhere, in a ruined barracks north of the city, a former enemy nurse closed her eyes and whispered the same words, not in English, but in prayer.